This is Idiot with Library Card, and on this episode, I'm going to be talking about the 1991 Stephen King novel, Needful Things. To start with, I will be getting into the plot of the book. Just to be forewarned, there are spoilers in this show. And I would say if you feel like you want to read the book before it being spoiled, it's definitely worth a read. It may be one of my favorite Stephen King novels. And I would say, in regards to King in general, my overall summary of his career, especially from someone who's just kind of interested in reading, is that he's written more good books than bad. And if you don't know, King is one of the most prolific writers of all time. He has so many novels out there. Most of them fall into the horror genre, or at least horror adjacent. And he's written some books I really love. And I would say what's neat is that it's not one of those situations where, although his writing has evolved and changed throughout times, I don't know if you can quite pinpoint a golden era of Stephen King. I think a lot of his great works, and especially the works I like, some are from early in his career, some are from the middle, and I mean, assuming because he's pretty old now, he's at the end of his career. I think some of his later and more recent books have been really good. And Needful Things definitely falls into that Stephen King books I really love. I would say some of the other ones are books like Joyland, which is actually a smaller story and I think less well-known novel, but one of my favorite. The sequel to The Shining, Doctor Sleep, I love that book, and those are two more recent novels by King. But I really want to focus on Needful Things, as I could go on a whole tangent about Stephen King's careers and the books I love and the books I absolutely hate, because there's some of those too. So to start with the book, Needful Things, and if, for example, you take this book out from the library, and I do need to apologize to my local library, as this book, Needful Things, is in fact quite overdue. On this book, there's a very small line on it. Needful Things is written in large print, but just above Needful Things, in a much smaller font, it says, "The Last Castle Rock Story." Now, Castle Rock, Maine is a fictitious town Stephen King has set a few of his novels in. Novels and short stories, and some of the more important short stories, especially The Body, which is a short story that was the inspiration for Stand By Me. And a few of the novels set in Castle Rock, for example, are Dead Zone, the book Cujo, and The Darker Half, which is probably the closest you could consider to a sequel to this book. Actually, I guess it would be a prequel in that this book, Needful Things, is more of a sequel of Darker Half. There are references to some of the short stories, probably more than I picked up on, just because I haven't read any of the Castle Rock books minus this one. Most of the references I picked up on were like references to Cujo, which was pretty clear, and definitely references to The Body. I think Ace Merle, who is like the strong, kind of the muscle bad guy in this book, I believe that is the Kiefer Sutherland character in The Body or in Stand By Me. But I've only ever seen the movie Stand By Me. And I've never actually read Cujo or even seen the movie from beginning to end. Although it kind of what it's about and what it is has permeated through pop culture. So I have like a understanding that it's a story about a big dog that I believe traps like a mother and son in a car. I'm pretty sure that's like the story. There's definitely references to it. And from my online research, which I did extensive or hardly any, the main character of this book is Sheriff Alan Pangborn, is also the main character in Darker Half. But I would say King does such a good job conveying the information that you need for this book that you might have had to pull from the other books, that, again, this book Needful Things could be the first Stephen King book you ever read, and you'd really enjoy it if you like these types of stories. So to get to the story, and I'm actually going to keep it pretty light on detail, as it's a story with a lot going on. And if I try to draw each character's story arc, it's going to look like that Charlie Day meme when he's working in the mailroom where everything's just a bunch of crazy, lines going in different directions. It would just be a disorganized mess. So I'm going to actually just try to stay with the story's through line. Basically, the story starts with a man opening a store in what seems kind of like a New England. I don't know if it's quite a beach town, but it's a town where there's more tourists in the summer, is the indication. And the store sounds something like a mix between what you'd find in a pawn shop and one of those like novelty. I can only think of like shore town stores. Particularly if you've ever been to Myrtle Beach, I'm thinking of a store called the Gay Dolphin, in which they just have a bunch of weird crap and interesting things. And so this store that he opens, it kind of morphs into like what you need it to be for him to sell the things, because the store and what type of store it is to pinpoint it isn't super important to the plot. The store owner's name is Leland Gaunt. And basically, people come in, and he sells things to people. Things that people have always wanted or have like a great desire for it. And what he does is he sells it to them for very little money, for kind of the money they have in their pocket, and then makes a deal with them. He basically will take some of their money and then ask them to do him. Usually he calls it play a little prank on someone else in town. And that's kind of the price for the things he sells on the surface. He sells things like a Sandy Koufax rookie card, or there's Elvis memorabilia, a circus glass, if you're familiar with that. I actually had to look it up. A ratchet set with both metric and US measurements. Kind of things that people have always wanted. That the ratchet set, for example, goes to a mechanic who thinks it's the coolest thing ever. And later on in the novel, you'll find out that the items that he's selling aren't actually what they appear or what he claims them to be. It's mostly like just junk and trash that sort of resembles what he says it is. You kind of get the sense that Leland Gaunt isn't human and has some sort of like evil power. In the end of the book, and as I said, I warned for spoilers, although this is like a half spoiler, in that in the end it turns out he's a demon. It's not really a spoiler because pretty early on he's like evil and he has some sort of magical force and is able to hypnotize people into, first off, seeing what he's selling them is not the trash he's selling them, but that the valuable thing they think it is. He makes the sale in which they give him money and he asks them to do him a favor or something like that, and it almost always is play a what seems like not quite an innocent prank, but not like a earth-shattering prank on a person, especially at the beginning of the novel. And some of the things he asks of the people seem mean, but not monstrous. For example, his first customer, kind of the start of the book, is a 12-year-old boy who he sells the Sandy Koufax card to. And he tells him that he has to go to someone's house and take mud and fling it on all their hanging laundry. So, they're hanging out laundry out back to dry, mostly sheets and blankets, and the kid takes mud and throws it all over their nice, new, clean laundry. And what happens is after he does it, there's an assumption from the victim of this mudding that another woman in town had done it. And this happens for basically everything he sells. He sells a thing, asks for the person to do a prank. The person does the prank, and it's kind of an asymmetrical battle in that the person who does the prank doesn't actually have any connection to the person that they are pranking. And generally when the prank, or at sometimes, like, I don't even know what to call after you call it a prank, because after a while the violence and nastiness of the pranks ratchet up throughout the story. But so these pranks are played. Generally, the person who the prank is played on thinks it's someone else, or doesn't think it's a prank at all, and thinks it's like an open attack on them. A lot of it involves like doing something and then leaving a note signed by someone else saying, like, there's a point where to get two guys to fight, he has two other people destroy their cars and then blame the two guys whose cars have been destroyed, and so they end up like being in conflict with each other when they really didn't do anything to each other. You also start to see, and this is kind of the third part of it, is after the prank and the fallout, the item sold starts to really take possession of the person it was sold to. In that they become obsessed with these items. Some of them have like, what would you, like, psychological powers to kind of put these people in trances or confuse them and make them see the world not as it is. And that's the thing. The items have mystical powers, some of them. For example, the town commissioner, or one of the town politicians, he keeps losing money at the horse race track. And he buys a game in which if you read the horses to the game, it's a little like metal fake horse racing track. If you read the names of the horse and then push it to run the race, it will give you the exact outcome of the race. And he ends up going to the track and winning a lot of money because of this little horse racing game. The Elvis memorabilia I talked about earlier. Two women, one gets sunglasses and another one gets like a picture of Elvis signed by Elvis. Like, put them in some sort of like sexual fantasy hypnosis where they're basically in their room like playing with themselves, fantasizing about Elvis, and they're doing this for like days on end. And now they are, and a lot of the people end up under Leland Gaunt's control. If you buy something from him, he ends up like kind of in your mind and can control you. Not 100%. It's not exactly clear how much he can control you. It's actually one of the few issues I have with the book, but I'll get to that later because it's actually the ending that sort of reveals it. And I go, oh, well, were these people doing this on their own accord, or was Mr. Gaunt controlling them? It's kind of a somewhere in between. It's not necessarily perfectly drawn out, but that's okay because it's a complicated book, and I think to add 20 pages on how exactly they're being controlled might have just been a waste. So all these pranks and all these little like crimes start to really create a strain in the town. And it causes some cracks in like solid relationships, but I think what it does more is it finds cracks within the town, people who don't like each other or don't trust each other, and really tears those cracks or those scabs open. And really ratcheting up the tension. In a small town, there's always a little tension between groups of people. In this book, for example, there's tension between the Baptists and the Catholics, because the Catholics are hosting a casino night, and the Baptists really think that's unchristian. So these cracks are exposed by Gaunt and widened to make the town more angry at each other and more violent towards each other. And I gotta say, this is really where Stephen King excels in this book. I've read a few, what would you call them, like small town Stephen King books. I can think of Under the Dome as one that is very similar to this in that it's like a small town with a wide cast of characters. And I hated Under the Dome. It was terrible. This is the big difference between the two is Under the Dome, all the characters are two-dimensional and feel very two-dimensional. And there's just no enrichingness of them. And Stephen King takes a long time to kind of describe them and show what kind of characters they are, and still they feel very flat. Where this book is the exact opposite. Stephen King does such a good job introducing characters, explaining them and what they're about, and building these characters and making them very rich characters in very short segments, in that you don't have to read for hours to kind of understand the characters or relate to them. And yet there are so many characters and they feel so rich. The town feels so lived in and the characters feel very real, which is great for a book like this. And it really gets you to relate to some, and some you like, and some you pity, and some you hate. It's a really well done book. I'm going to rave about this book a lot, but the best thing, especially early on in the book, is Stephen King's ability to introduce a character, give you something to kind of grab onto, and make the character feel three-dimensional, and then kind of follow through with like a few simple things you point out, like a fatal flaw of the character or a general attitude, and make it form the story going forward without bogging you down with each character. Going, oh, I can't believe they're introducing another character. I can't handle all this. And it's done just so well. So that's kind of the beginning of the story. Is people come in, the first few characters are introduced, they buy something from Leland Gaunt, they have to go do something bad to someone else, and then the thing they bought starts to like take possession of them. And as the story goes on, the things Gaunt asks his customers to do become more extreme. One person is tasked with killing a dog, which he does. He goes into the person's house and murders the dog. And the kid who muddied the sheets is asked to go back to that house and smash everything with rocks. Like smash the windows, smash the big screen TV, all that stuff. And some of the rocks have notes on them from actually the woman whose dog is killed. What ends up happening is that the woman whose dog is killed and the woman who had her sheets muddied and then her house busted up with rocks, they blame each other for these events. Mostly because of things that had happened before the novel like starts up. They've already had some issues, these two women, and now they blame each other. The one blames the one for killing her dog. She assumes it was her. The other one blames the other for smashing her windows and muddying her sheets. So they end up basically attacking each other in the streets of suburbia with knives, and they end up murdering each other. And I would say this is the part of the book where our protagonist really starts to make a show. He's been introduced, but not really fleshed out yet. It's Sheriff Alan Pangborn, and he's the sheriff of the town. So, you know, when a double murder happens, he gets involved. And it's funny because it's done interestingly in that murder really isn't his jurisdiction. The like county and state police end up taking over. He's kind of a small crimes, small town sheriff. But obviously Alan is involved in the investigation. And as he starts adding things up, he realizes that things don't quite connect. And his investigation through quite a few chapters ends up leading him to the kid with the Sandy Koufax card that broke all the windows and TVs and stuff. He goes and questions the kid, and the kid ends up going and killing himself a few chapters later. But I will say there is a good bit of novel between the murder and the sheriff kind of running down his leads, leading to that kid, the Sandy Koufax kid. I will say one of the things that King does well is he gives some of his characters some interesting little quirks that really let them stand out, and that does help make the characters feel deeper and more interesting. Alan, for example, and this becomes pretty important towards the end of the book, one of the things he likes to do is, like when he's alone in his office, he makes shadow puppets on the wall. And he likes to do, especially when questioning kids or something, he likes to do little magic tricks involving, like, you know, oh, the coin's behind your ear. But he also has, like, a trick where a little bouquet of paper flowers will like pop out of his sleeve and into his hand. But basically after the murder, that's what sends Alan in the direction of searching for answers, and I guess what kind of makes him our protagonist, because that's a lot of times what a protagonist does is looks for answers in your story, and that tends to push your story forward as he finds answers. I will say the book does a good job. After the murder happens, it slows back down, and the pranks actually kind of slow back down too. They go back to ruining relationships and not going in and stabbing a dog to death. It starts to ratchet back up and actually surpasses the last kind of pinnacle of violence, and the next midi climax is more violent and more extreme. This next outpouring of violence, instead of one murder, there's now multiple deaths in kind of like one time frame, in that the kid that bought the Sandy Koufax card thinks he's in trouble with the police. Mr. Gaunt's in his head, and he also feels like he might have caused the murder of a woman. He can't take it anymore, so he kills himself with a shotgun. There's a triple shooting at a bar, and someone comes in and attacks one of the police officers who thinks he's sleeping with his girlfriend or something. And again, it's kind of all these deaths and violence are caused by basic misunderstandings caused by Leland Gaunt's quote-unquote pranks. And after this outbreak of violence, the state police basically come in and take control of the town, because obviously the small town sheriff's department is just not up to all this violence that's breaking out. And the story really rockets off into the next climax and outbreak of violence. There's a little breath after this last outbreak, but it really ratchets up towards the end of the book. Basically, in which you have the town commissioner with the horse racing stuff, and Ace Merle, kind of the bad guy of the town, planning dynamite all around town. And at the same time, Leland Gaunt has basically closed his story. He's kind of done selling and making deals with things, and ends up just giving out semi-automatic pistols to people. He basically just starts giving out firearms, and with all the bombs set. And he also gives smoke bombs to some people. They actually smoke bomb both the Baptist church meeting and the Catholic church meeting. They blame each other, and both congregations end up in this like large scale brawl in the middle of the street. And as I said, this is a great book, and I really tried to stick with the main through line. And I would say that is the main through line. There's a bunch of different stories, and they end at different times because people die or their story gets resolved, although only really the main characters' stories get resolved. Everyone else kind of dies or comes out of a trance when Leland Gaunt is stopped. I do want to focus, because I haven't really focused on, I've focused on a little flashes of scene. I do want to focus on the last scene, because I think it is the best as far as messaging and an allegory. It's just, it works really well, and I want to go into it, because it took me a minute when I first read it. I didn't like it ending like this, and then I thought about it and thought it was a really clever and smart ending, definitely on theme. So Mr. Gaunt is about to actually leave town, as most of the town is in flames, as the bombs that the two guys working for Gaunt have started going off. There's brawls everywhere. There's shootings with a bunch of people holding their new pistols from Mr. Gaunt. And basically there's just chaos all over the town. And I don't want to draw the whole scene out, but basically there's like a last chance to save the town and save himself, and Alan and one of his deputies in a different car, and the oldest man in town. It's an interesting little we'll call it a Mexican standoff, but basically Leland Gaunt has done everything he wants. He's leaving with a bag that seems to be alive and seems to be important. Alan needs to stop him from leaving, and he really needs to get that bag. So what he does is he has one of those fake cans of peanuts with him that when you open it up, a bunch of like little paper snakes pop out of. He opens that at Gaunt, and the snakes that spring out become real. And I'll get into why. It's not actually very well drawn out, but like Alan isn't magical like that. Like he doesn't have any magic powers. But it's just important to realize that the snakes become real. They bite Gaunt, and Gaunt freaks out and drops his bag. Alan grabs the bag and is holding it. And basically then Alan starts making shadow puppets of a hawk and like a dog, and it chases, they scare Gaunt and actually attack him in real life. And then he pulls out his little flower trick, and the flowers become like this holy, unearthly light, and it shoots like a flashlight onto Gaunt, who has now become like his demon form. It is a little hokey with so much death and destruction, and like a 12-year-old shoots himself with a shotgun in this book. The end is like imagination will overcome everything. But I really do like the message. Again, for its hokiness, it really works for the book, and I think it's a nice universal message without being like preachy or stupid. The book is very anti-consumerism, as I read it. I've not read any sort of interviews by Stephen King regarding this book, or actually anything he's ever said about this book. But I would say it's clear that the book's message is something like, be careful about the things you own because they can own you. Also, it's an examination of what are people willing to do to other people to get items and things, not other people, just crap basically that they want. I like the ending because it's actually an answer to how to fight consumerism and products and things taking over your life. And I like that because a lot of times you'll get anti-consumerism. I wouldn't call this book anti-capitalist. I don't think it's like a Marxist screed. I'm not saying that, but a lot of times you'll get those anti-business, anti-consumerism, anti-capitalism books. And what they do is they just draw out the system's terrible and the only remedy is to burn the whole system down. And this book is not like that. Alan fights the demon with imagination. And again, as hokey as it sounds, it's a great message. I just think it's interesting because that is a lot of people who are obsessed with things and owning collectibles and things like that. I do think, and there's nothing wrong with those things if you're doing it like within reason, but I think a lot of people who get obsessed with items and material things tend to be people who lack imagination and don't work out that muscle. And your imagination muscle, and this sounds very kindergarten teacher, blue hair weirdo, but your imagination muscle needs to be worked out, and you need to be someone who uses their imagination, and you'll be able to escape a lot of like being stuck with just consumerism and being stuck with the only thing making you happy is buying something new. Your imagination prevents you from looking for things to buy to fix your life. You realize that a lot of what you can do to fix your life is in your head, and sometimes that's actual action, but sometimes it's just changing the way you're thinking or thinking about something else, or when you're bored, instead of going and buying something or you using something bought, sometimes you can just sit, in your house and use your imagination, and that is just as good. Again, it's a very hokey sort of message, but I think it really brushes against an internal truth. And I just think this book does that really well. It's probably the strongest thing the book does, is it really examines these eternal truths about greed and what people are willing to do to each other, but also on the positive side, the beauties of imagination and friendship and truly caring about people and loving them. This book was a blast to read. It's a lot of fun. It actually, for a Stephen King book, although I think a lot of his books do tend to have happier endings and really good moral lessons. Sometimes he's really able to do like all three at the same time, is make a fun horror suspense novel with some real deep truths and timeless, profound themes, and tie it all together in what's, again, a very simple and entertaining book that has a lot of depth to it. I really love this book. It does so many things really well that I haven't even gotten into. There's just so much in the book. It's very dense. It's a thicker book. It probably falls into the middle to high page count or word count as far as Stephen King's concerned, but he has some books that dwarf this one. It's definitely worth a read. It moves really well. The pacing's perfect. The plotting's perfect. I love this book. I can't recommend it enough. If you've never read a Stephen King novel, I think this one's a fine one to start with. If you've read a bunch of Stephen King novels and never read this one, I think you'll absolutely love it. So yeah, check out Needful Things by Stephen King. It's definitely an older book, more than 30 years old, but still resonates today. So yeah, check it out. And it probably is at your local library or in your library system. Maybe not Montgomery County, because it seems like I know I'm holding one copy way longer than I should have, but after I record this, I'm going to the library to drop it off, so you're welcome. And with that, please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you get your podcasts. I have no idea what I'm doing next, although it might be a historical novel about the Aztec Empire, which looks pretty interesting, so look out for that.